Hello and welcome to today's webcast. I am your host, Lucy Sheriff from the Register. Today we are going to be looking at email in the cloud and the cloud in the real world. We're going to be looking at that kind of awkward zone where a bespoke system is beyond the wildest possible dreams of your budget, and your credit card and off the shelf just isn't going to cut it because it's too complicated. As ever, with me I have a team of glorious experts to help us unpick the difficult questions and the knotty issues that turn up. Let's just quickly have an introduction. We've got Tim here from Perspicuity on the end. We've got Julian from the Schools Network. And as ever, we have the lovely Dale from Freeform Dynamics, who is here to give us the view from the trenches, what you guys are telling us about what's really going on. And last but not least, we of course have you. So please don't be afraid to pitch in. If you look above my head, you will notice that there are some buttons. These are the ones that you press to send us questions. Please send us questions. We'd be lost without you. You guys know how this stuff works better than any of us. So ask the questions that you want to know the answers to, and I will put them to the panel. So if we can just move quickly along. Why are we here? We are here to look at the middle zone. Dale, this is something that you have as a little bit of a hobby horse. The middle zone, the real world with cloud. Why don't you set the scene for us a little bit?
So for those of you that haven't come across me before, I'm an industry analyst and we're one of the Register's research partners. So I sort of live in two worlds, I suppose, in terms of getting feedback from people and getting input. One of them is the world of the vendors and service providers, where everything is really easy and magical and transformational and innovative and all that kind of stuff. But I also live in the world of the Reg readers because we do all of the reader studies. So if you guys have ever filled out one of our surveys, then that's us sitting behind it. Exactly. So we're the guys that crunch numbers and come up with all those pretty charts. And those two worlds are so often miles apart. I mean, particularly around this area of cloud, where a lot of vendors and service providers make it sound very, very easy. As you were saying earlier on, whip out your credit card, sign up and go.
And even to the extent that it's a fear factor. It's like, your employees could be doing this without you. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, the reality is obviously that these are IT solutions, whichever way you cut it. They're just alternative ways of delivering IT. So just like any IT solution, there's a lot to be done if you're going to move from one solution to another in terms of migration, integration, all that kind of stuff. So the practicality is quite different.
Specifically today, though, we're going to be looking at something that's largely driven by a need to change an email system.
Yeah.
Email's one of those things you kind of, as a user, you don't even think about it. It's part of breathing as a
It's a really interesting one, actually. A lot of people think of email as being just a horizontal facility. It's just it's there embedded in your network. It's there pervasive around your organisation. What's interesting is one of the charts we see here is something that came out of a recent Reg Reader study where we just said, well, how much is email actually embedded in business processes? And when you think about it, I mean, we've listed some of them here, whether it's sales or marketing or R&D or there's all sorts of business processes, customer service. You find that where that process is important to an organisation, typically email is a pretty important part of that process. I don't take much working out. So I think it's easy to underestimate how critical and actually quite hard email is because it's so woven into the fabric. I mean, the other thing is from an email perspective, users actually have quite a lot of control over how email is set up, configured and used. I mean, that's something that we were talking about earlier, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and this is something we found was a real challenge for us, that because users can set up permissions with each other, and often they will have shared mailboxes as well, they can set up client-side rules. How they are using email is a large part of that is invisible to IT, and that's quite a challenge when you want to change it.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually. One of the other things that comes out of the research quite strongly is email is one of those things you kind of lots of people take for granted. It's kind of worked in the way it has since you last upgraded your email system. And it's only when you start asking questions about could things be done better in terms of different forms of access, different control mechanisms, just basic facilities, that people say, well, actually, yeah, probably, the world has moved on in terms of what can be done, and there probably is some benefits in moving forward. So we do find that whilst people do, knee-jerk reaction is, well, email's email, it kind of works, so let's not worry about it. When you dig a little bit, you do find that there's actually quite a lot of need to move forward and upgrade it.
And so this is where cloud kind of really comes into its own, because it's bigger and you can do more with it, perhaps, or is it just a question of scale?
I think the cloud's got various motivations associated with it. A lot of people talk about, go to the cloud and you save money. That is not always the case in terms of the feedback we get from certainly Reg readers and other research that we do. Mostly the motivations around cloud are to make life a little bit easier for IT, to accelerate bringing new capability on board, and those kind of things. So it's usually about driving better service levels, being able to do things that you'd find either quite hard to do with your traditional on-site system, or it will take you a long time to do it, and you've got users in the meantime sort of screaming for new stuff. So.
And this is where we get to the nub of the question, really, isn't it? Because once you realise that the system that you're dealing with is so critical to your business, you have to get it right. You can't go in half-cocked and mess everybody's email systems.
I don't think it's worth going through this chart that we have up in any detail.
It's so nice and swirly, Dale.
It's nice and swirly, isn't it? Yeah. It's a project. An email migration to the cloud is no different to any other sort of migration or IT project. I don't know. You guys have that sort of...
certainly since email often is so critical to a lot of businesses, obviously you want to, if you are thinking about moving to the cloud, you want to do that in such a way that it's as least disruptive to your business as possible. And so, because of that, it does take quite a lot of planning up front to make sure that the migration does go as smooth as possible, certainly.
So I think it would probably make sense at this point if I just ask Julian to tell us a little bit more about the schools network as an organisation and kind of how you see what you guys are doing fitting into the landscape that Dale's been outlining. Because one of the things I think that when we were talking earlier, you said is that you're dealing with a corporate scale business with a small business budget.
Absolutely. The Schools Network is a charity based in London. It's a membership organisation for schools, and the objective of the organisation is to improve education performance and make sure that every child gets the best education that they can. To do that, we have obviously our own staff, and at the time we were doing this project we had about 200 people working for us in the UK. Alongside that, we have some schools where we provide the education resource in Abu Dhabi, and we had approximately 250 people working in those who were being serviced from the UK email servers. And those people work very largely with our membership. So our UK-based staff are very active with our schools membership, and they're out and about quite a lot, working all around the UK. So being able to access their email effectively, work together easily, really from wherever they are, is really, really important to what they do. And
from an IT perspective, this is not just a little bit distributed. This is a very... You guys aren't in one place in a nice, manageable little office. Well, no, they tend to work around the UK, and all of that was being serviced from an email installation in a hosting co-location in London at the time. Okay. So can you take us through what your setup was before you embarked on this migration? A little bit of a... So where we were coming from, we were running Exchange 2007, as I say, on dedicated servers sitting in a colo in London. The servers were quite old and were starting to give us some real performance issues. Also a concern that inevitably in a small organisation, particularly running on a charity budget, it's quite hard to have sufficient IT resource. So the people you have are pulled in a lot of directions, and looking after email servers and keeping them running is quite resource intensive. It needs guys who know what they're doing, and it takes up quite a bit of their time. So we were finding that an awful lot of the user issues we were having to deal with were couldn't get hold of email through VPN, email had gone down for some reason or whatever, and the servers were becoming somewhat unreliable.
So we were faced with wanting to change those. Also, very much as part of my strategy, I wanted to reduce our dependence on having co-location and on-premise equipment. For an organisation of that size, with the range of services you can now acquire from the cloud, particularly for general business purposes like email, it really makes no sense at all to try and provision it for yourself these days. It's really about choosing your moment. I mean, we touched a little bit about, the cloud can save you money. One of the big arguments that cloud providers will use is it's operating costs, you don't need to make capital investment. That only works if actually you don't have anything on your balance sheet for that service. If you've got stuff on your balance sheet and you're paying depreciation on your budget, your CFO is not usually very happy if you say, I'm just going to stop using that and take on a new operating cost. But we had a window of opportunity. Our equipment was old, it was written down. We needed to do something different, and it was a great time to look at a different way of doing it.
Yeah. And you have said that your ambition is to own no tin.
That would be my ambition, absolutely.
That's your stated goal.
Yes.
Okay, great. So you guys then, you went to Perspicuity,
well,
or were you already working together?
We already had a relationship with Perspicuity, who've been looking after our websites for about a year and a half now. And because they are also involved in Office 365, they were the obvious people for us to talk to get some technical help. And certainly with these products where you're taking them as a cloud service from a large multinational vendor, it's quite useful to have a partner on side who has a different route into that vendor.
Yeah. And
sometimes that's how you get the answer.
Okay. So what was... You have a general approach that you want to get into the cloud whenever possible to reduce the amount of tin that you have. Is that a kind of is this very much part of this? Or?
That's a guiding view. I mean, it's always subject to the business case, and obviously it moves the pressure to other places. If you put everything into the cloud, your internet connection becomes more than a convenience; it becomes an absolute critical business requirement. So if you're not careful, you solve one problem and create another one. So you have to take a systemic view of what you're doing.
So where do you start then when you're looking at a project of this size? I mean, you've got 450 mailboxes, at least 3 different countries involved. Where do you begin, Tim? When you guys sat down and started talking about this, how long ago was this for a start?
I think we started planning for it probably a good 3 or 4 months before the migration actually took place. And it started with trying to identify how are the schools network using their email, where is it being used, things like what devices are they using to access their email. They've got phones, obviously laptops, and perhaps other devices. So trying to look at all the different ways that email is being used, and then from there start to understand then what would be involved in trying to migrate across to the cloud and Office 365, in at least as a least disruptive way as possible. There's an Office 365 site which has got a lot of useful information about how to plan for your migrations. So email migrations and SharePoint migrations and so on. And that has a sort of number of templates, if you like, that have questions on that help you think about, actually, yes, we do use email in that way. And so, so we started to run through some of those things with the schools network to try and help plan. Yeah.
Out of interest, did you look at any other alternatives to Office 365? You don't have to name them, but I'm just...
Us as in Perspicuity, no. Because we're quite closely aligned with Microsoft, so generally most of the things we do involve Microsoft.
We did look around.
Yeah.
I mean, there are 2 real contenders in this space at the moment, without needing to... I think everyone who's watching will work out which ones I'm talking about. And each has strengths and things where you think maybe that's not quite so good. At the end of the day, a lot of it was around user familiarity. We knew the users were very happy with the way they worked, or certainly very comfortable with the way they worked with the Exchange product and the Outlook product. So at the time we felt that was probably the deciding factor, given that in technical terms either probably would have solved the job.
Yeah, okay.
And we hear that a lot actually from research feedback from people. It's amazingly big factor in the whole equation. If you're going to disrupt things, you want to disrupt as little as possible.
When you've got so much else going on, training people to use new things, it's probably not the priority. I've got a question here from Ben, who is getting a bit ahead of himself. He would like to know what the migration experience was like. I promise we're getting there. In fact, we're getting there now. What was the migration experience like?
At first, quite painful. And a lot of that pain was around things we were doing to make it easier for the users at the end. I mean, we were very clear that we needed to have single sign-on. But then when we started thinking about single sign-on, we realised that actually the way we had Active Directory set up probably wasn't going to be the best way to do it, in terms of even things like usernames. Technology has this awful habit of reminding you of the decisions you made 5 years ago that seemed like a good idea at the time. And like a lot of organisations, we had usernames which were different from the email address. Going to a federated single sign-on environment, people are having to type in their username into places when they're thinking they're using email. And again, thinking about how we would keep things easy for the users is that we want them to look the same. So the first thing we did was actually change the way usernames appeared inside the organisation, so that instead of being initial surname, it went to being first name dot last name, just as the email address was. So that in itself was a piece of change. We then had to work out how to make the federation and the domain syncing work, and we had a few false starts there. Again, in part, it's because it was a big learning curve for our tech guys. So it's things which, in hindsight, are quite obvious about you need to have the primary domain be one that's publicly routable, which, if you think about it, should be obvious. But again,
sometimes it's not obvious.
It wasn't obvious until we got there. So actually, we, having got some synchronization working, we had to back it out, stop it, reconfigure, and start again. So there were a few false starts. But once we got that working, we then we put a small number of people into a pilot. Firmly believe in the principle of eating your own dog food as a CIO, so I was the first person in the pilot. And mostly it worked. I quite liked the fact that no one who was still on premise could see my diary. That was good for me.
Some people aren't so keen on that.
But obviously, that, in terms of thinking about a pilot group of users, that would have been a drawback. So we looked at what we needed to do to roll out, and we did start doing a bit of a sample. Let's do it 10 at a time, because we have to manage the client change, we have to manage configuration change, we have to manage training the user. We did that for 10 people, and we realised it had all got a bit complicated and messy already. And it's, as I was saying earlier, things like shared mailboxes, things like mail routing rules that users have put up, permissions that they had set up to work together in sort of ad hoc ways, which broke as soon as you tried to do a coexistence. We weren't doing the full hog coexistence, we were doing a partial coexistence. So having run around probably for a week to 10 days trying to fix those things, we stepped back, we reevaluated what we were doing with a lot of help from Tim and his colleagues, and decided that Big Bang was the answer.
Okay, so having originally planned to do it in a kind of stepwise, trickle fashion, nice and gentle, in terms of changing what you were planning to do, how did you guys approach that? How did you handle the change in dealing with staff and telling everyone it's happening now, or did you take a little bit of time to get more things in place first?
Well, we went away and we prepared some communications for them. We also looked quite hard at how we were going to do the client deployment and looked at how we could deploy things ahead of time. Again, like a lot of smaller organisations, struggling with remote deployment of software to the desktop, something which in a large organisation you take for granted, but not something we had deployed. So we were looking at people self-helping, our IT team going around and helping them download stuff, working. Don't forget, as I said, we had 200 people working 5 time zones away. So we had to come up with a plan to help steer them through how they could self-help and install the software. And then once we'd done all that, we just said, OK, this coming weekend, email is going to be disrupted for the weekend. And we did it. Tim will probably give you a bit more detail.
So you talked about installing software. I mean, all this stuff is in the cloud. So what software are you talking about?
So there's with Office 365, there's various requirements that your computer needs to meet to use it properly. So, for example, there's various patches and software, Windows patches and so on, security patches that that need to be there in order for Office 365 to work properly. There's certain things that your Internet Explorer, your browser, needs to be set up in a certain way to work properly with the SharePoint side of things. And so there's so Office 365 actually provide a little desktop setup tool to do a lot of that for you, which is fine for people who have laptops that they've got full access to, which may be the case in sort of lots of small businesses. People just have administration access to their laptop, but in a business the size of the schools network, where they do need to apply some control around what people can and can't do to their laptops, in a lot of cases actually people didn't have sufficient permissions to run that desktop setup tool. So it wasn't just a simple case of just asking people to click on a link and run something. Unfortunately, it was more involved in that. And,
took a little bit more input.
Yeah, there was more manual steps that needed to be carried out by the end users. It wasn't as straightforward as Microsoft would like it to be.
Yeah, for sure.
Can I ask a question in terms of expectation setting for users? I mean, was the expectation that they would go through you would go through a migration process, and at the other end, they would still have all their settings in place, their rules, their workflow, etc., etc.?
Very much so. The way I sold this to the managers in the business and the staff in the business was, it'll just keep working, and it'll be better because you'll have more space. I mean, we didn't touch on that, but other than that, it'll just work. So yes, we did have a little bit of an expectation management.
Yeah. And did it? And did that come to pass?
Well, certainly now, yes, it does just work. I think at the time there were a few hiccups, and largely it was around things like individual variations in rights, individual variations in software builds, individual differences. Some people were running Outlook 2007, some were running Outlook 2010, and the experience is different. We had issues because we had gone through a partial migration. We had issues with things like auto discovery. So it was only when we found out, with Tim's help, that there were ways we could put auto discovery information on the client machine as well as relying what was on the server, that we worked our way through that. So it's all of those things which, again, a lot of them come from the challenges of not having a completely locked down build and not having a full remote deployment tool set, which, again, things in a larger organisation you would expect to be in place, but which the business case for is much harder when you're talking about 1, 2, 3, 400 desktops.
Yeah.
Just a quick question here from Gary. He says, can the panel confirm that the minimum requirements when using Outlook is 2007 or above? For some organisations, this would mean expenditure to upgrade. Is that something that you ran into at all, or were you already kind of at that point?
So, if you've got, for example, Office 2003, that isn't compatible with Office 365. It is Outlook 2007 or above. And in terms of expenditure, I think it depends on which plan you go for on Office 365, because there's some plans that include the Office suite with that plan. So, if you've got that plan, then obviously there's no expenditure to go out and buy Office licenses because it's included.
It's included. Were you, with the schools network, did you have a bit of upgrading to do in terms of getting your software up to the hub?
No, we were. In terms of Office, we were running. Most people were on 2007. We had a few who'd already upgraded to 2010.
So you were already at the minimum, so that wasn't so.
It's interesting. I'm just seeing a question there from Stuart. What about bandwidth?
Yes.
And as I said, internet is an issue. We already had quite a significant network connection from our main office. So because most of our stuff was in a hosting centre, so we already had 100 megabit going into the main office. So our view was this will probably cope, but and in practice that has been okay.
It has been okay. Yeah. Okay. We have another question from Matthew quickly. How was there flexibility for your unique requirements, or did you have to conform to a one-size-fits-all offering, or was that what you needed? Was it kind of a chance to iron out some of the complexity?
Interesting question. I mean, in a sense, you get what you get. That's a cloud offering. And in terms of delivering email to end users, that's fine. We had some learning curve around how shared mailboxes would work in the cloud. and how to do the permissions and things like that. But we've been able to find that works okay. Where we have had to do some more work is around applications that have used SMTP Relay to send emails out. And there are some, well, Microsoft suggests some workarounds to doing that where you still need some on-premise service. And we're working through that now with our with our mainframe application. They're not mainframes, but you know what I mean. Mainframe applications, yeah.
It's an interesting question, though. I mean, a lot of what we get back is there's two philosophies. Because when you look around most people's IT infrastructure, you find was, as you were saying earlier on, decisions were made 5 years ago, 10 years ago sometimes, that seemed like a good idea at the time. And maybe the business environment has changed, or the operational environment, technology has certainly changed. And so a lot of what's in place, quite often it doesn't make sense to try and move it forward. So things that were a bespoke customization 5 years ago, 10 years ago, quite often today is a feature, a soft configuration. I'm broadening out beyond email here, just in terms of sort of cloud services in general. So one school of thought is, actually, if you are going to take cloud-type services on board, use that as an opportunity to maybe clean things up a little bit and revisit some of those decisions. Other people are still very obsessed with it's got to work the way we want it, but I think more people are leaning, because of history really, they've been burned.
I mean, we certainly find, not necessarily with the work that we did with the school's network, but other Office, migrations to Office 365 that we've done, it certainly is an opportunity to rethink actually some of the way that the old systems have worked, and actually is it still relevant now, basically in some cases redesign or get rid of some of those old applications, and that's actually more the case with not just the email side of Office 365, but more the SharePoint side as well. So SharePoint opens up a lot of opportunities to perhaps start doing things in a different way, and hopefully a better way.
Okay, I see there's a question there from Stu about support on non-Windows clients. I can say a little about that, although Tim may be able to say some more. We have a few people who use Macs, although they use a Windows VM on their Mac, so that's not held us back. We've been able to deploy this for them because they're running it inside a Windows VM. iPhone, absolutely no problem at all. It just appears in your iPhone as a Microsoft Exchange email service. You just have to put in different details and it works fine.
Okay. Nice and easy. And
the other thing with the Macs as well, so iPhone, iPad, also Android, we've done work on as well. So the email certainly works very well on those devices. Things like SharePoint also works very well, and with I can't remember which plan it is with Office 365, but you also get the Office web applications included. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and so on. So if you've got those Office documents stored in SharePoint and you're accessing it with an iPad, for example, it just opens up those documents within the browser, and you can edit as well. So it does work very well.
Cool. Okay. Can we just go back to the? Let's have a quick look at this slide. You were talking about some of the issues that you kind of ran into during your migration stage, and the things that you learned. If you were starting again, having been through the process once, what would you do differently in the initial stages of your planning? How would you approach it differently? Top tips for anyone who was to come afterwards.
I think a key thing is looking at your existing infrastructure around how AD is set up, certificates, domains, things like that, because a lot of the hassle we had in setting up the single sign-on at the beginning was because the way we had things engineered, probably as a result of history, was not what is now considered best practice. Okay. So, and again, I think it's inevitable in any IT organisation, but particularly in a small to medium organisation where you are really pushed for resource and you really do not have the opportunity just to keep things changing for the sake of it. Quite often you find that what you've got in your infrastructure is slightly out of date. And new product sets like the cloud tend to be engineered to work with current best practice thinking. So going back and reviewing the way some of your engineering around that is done is a really good thing, I think, because that causes problems.
So don't be afraid to go for a blank slate. Don't be afraid to go right back.
I think you have to go back to first principles, because those things do tend to catch you out. And I think the single sign-on is a really good example of what we see now with technologies, that technologies which are really easy for the user to use and really simple and present really nicely, under the hood are horrendously complicated, and you have to go back and get that right, or else it'll break in any one of a number of ways.
Yeah, and that's come across through time and time again in these webcasts that we've done with other people who've gone through these sorts of migrations, and also in research. Getting that groundwork done beforehand is worthwhile, and if you try and rush it, it'll come back and bite. Actually, you'll find you hit roadblocks and you have to sort of do it in flight, which is not a good idea, really.
So you talked a little bit about identifying the suitable batches of user for your migrations and kind of making the migration period short. Once you had done the switchover in the following week, how long did it take for little red flags to start popping up and for things to need to be sort of tweaked and problems to shake out?
It was a slow drip feed, I think, of people saying, actually, I used to be able to access this mailbox. Why can't I? Mm-hmm. This email used to go there when this happened. Something seems to have changed. Things like that. We found users were really good at setting up their phones. We prepared a really detailed document to give to people saying, look, this is how you set up your phone to work with the new email. And I think we only had 2 people who came back and said, can't do this. Or it doesn't work.
Yep. So just a quick question, does the calendar sync with mobiles too, says John?
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Nice and quick.
Yes, so iPhones, iPads, yes it does, and Windows 7 phones obviously. I'm not 100% sure with Androids, I can't remember, but I would imagine it does.
Yeah, it's active sync based, isn't it? So it's it basically sees the 4 main services: contacts, email, calendar, and tasks.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, must admit I was half tempted to go and get my phone and have a look.
I think you can switch them on and not off.
Yeah, you can choose which
ones you want to come through.
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question here from Francis, who would like to know, if I was to implement a hybrid installation, would a full migration be possible at a later date, as I plan to fully migrate, but gradually? Now, this is quite an interesting question, I think, for you guys, because although the email side of things you've kind of gone full big bang on, other aspects of Office 365 you're doing little bit by little bit. So is a hybrid to full migration possible, advisable?
I think perhaps what was it Francis? What Francis is talking about here. So there's hybrid is the term that's used for the coexistence. So in Office 365 there's a few different ways that you can migrate your email across. And the term hybrid, or I think it used to be called rich coexistence, if that's what Francis is referring to, is where actually you can make your current email system and the Office 365 email system work together. So you can migrate more gradually. In order to do that, you do need Exchange 2010 in your current email environment, or at least one Exchange 2010 server. So if you don't have one, you need to implement one in order to do the rich coexistence. But what that allows you to do is migrate more gradually, because the 2 email systems are talking to each other. You can still share calendars, you can share email boxes and things like that, as if it's one email system, and then migrate people a lot more slowly.
Okay.
So that's the idea of the hybrid one. If that's what Francis is asking. So.
Okay.
I think the point there is there's work involved in actually enabling the migration, isn't there? So you have to make a choice. How long do you need that coexistence for? If you're just after a convenient way of phasing, it's a hard call sometimes, because it might be overkill to do the work to maintain that interim position. In which case you might be better just accelerating through. But
what we find is that if people have already got an Exchange 2010 environment, then the rich coexistence model is the obvious one to go down, even if you want to do it in a short period of time or not.
It's just so much more comfortable to have that.
But in most situations, actually, one of the reasons why they want to move to the cloud is perhaps because they've got an old email system. So they were implementing a new server just to do the migration.
In fact, you end up doing 2 migrations.
It's not necessarily something that they want to do.
Yes, and I think probably the real final marker is when you move your MX records, which we did a month ago, so that they stopped pointing at the in-premise, which was then routing to the cloud, and we just changed them to point straight to the cloud. And I think we only had one user who we'd accidentally forgotten. He suddenly found that their email wasn't working.
Sitting there, I'm still on premise, everyone else is in the cloud. Right, lots of questions coming in now, actually. We've got, we haven't even touched on this at all. Mike is keen to understand costs per seat per month per MS product with the Outlook, Excel, SharePoint versus Enterprise. Can it be included in a volume agreement? He would like to know. How have you found that side of things working for you guys? Has it been relatively straightforward?
I think reasonably straightforward.
Yeah.
The billing seems to work. I don't think it quite joins up with our enterprise agreement. We actually have a different agreement for our cloud products. But Tim may be able to speak more about that. But then the costs, they're on the website.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's on the Office 365 website, there's a page that goes through I think they've got 3 or 4 different plans. There's a P plan, which is aimed at the small business, and then they've got their E plans, E1 to E3 or E4, which are aimed at slightly larger companies, although we know a number of small companies that have gone for the E plan as well. So there's no rules around, with the E plans, there's no rules around what's the minimum number of users and so on. I think there is with the P, I think it's up to 50 users or something like that. But it's basically just a case of going through, what features and functions each of those plans have, and deciding what's the best fit for you compared to how much you want to spend per month.
Okay.
Yeah, some of the entry-level stuff is web only, isn't it? And so it's very akin to something like Google Apps in that sense. What we find, though, and we got this back through research quite strongly, is that a web-only solution is actually quite limited, even for small companies. So most people are telling us at the moment that they want effectively a client-server type of approach with an Outlook client on the actual machine itself.
Yeah, so I think that the web what we find is the people that go for the web-only approach perhaps have already got Office licenses that they've already paid for.
Yeah.
So they go for that, and they still use the thick client on their machine, to get to their email. But for companies that perhaps have got old versions of Office 2003, and they haven't paid for the upgrade or whatever, then the plans that include the thick clients make a lot more sense to them.
Yeah.
Obviously they're paying per user per month now, rather than a one outright cost for the CD.
Got some more questions coming in. When you moved over to Office 365, did you move all your existing mails over into it so users still had their emails? And if you did, how hard was that? Says John.
The position we were in before we moved, we had obviously people's mailboxes, but they were quite small, and that was another challenge we had. And a lot of people with stuff in PST files. So the approach we took, we migrated the mailboxes using the tools that exist in the mailbox migration tool. And then we showed users how they could migrate content out of their PSTs into their mailbox, which of course was now much larger for themselves. So we left users to do that as a self-help. Because it's just a drag and drop. They can just decide, yes, I want that folder, or no, I don't.
Yeah, so Office 365, as part of the Office 365 package, you get access to a migration tool. If you want to use that migration tool, and most people do, you need to do various things to your existing Exchange setup to make it available. It's called Outlook. Outlook Anywhere. It may already be set up, so people who use webmail and things already have Outlook Anywhere set up. But you need to make sure that's set up in the correct way, so that then the Office 365 email can see it. And then you can just use this migration tool to say, I want to migrate these users, and then it pushes all the email over for you. There are certain things, there are certain things you need to be careful of that you get right with the Outlook Anywhere configuration, otherwise it doesn't work. And there's a quite a useful tool to test your Outlook anywhere configuration, so to tell you whether it's going to work or not.
Okay, more questions. ADFS requires 5 servers. This seems rather a lot.
Yes, it seems rather a lot to me as well. The figure of 5 is actually to a resilient setup, because you need ADFS. Now, typically, you would put that on your on-premise LAN. So then, if you're going to federate to a cloud service, you then need a federation proxy sitting in the DMZ. Actually, it might be 6 servers, not 5. Then ADFS configuration is stored in a database, which can either be an integral Windows database or a SQL Server one. We chose to go SQL Server, although it's a tiny database, and we might refactor that. So that's 3. Then add ADFS and ADFS proxy resilience, because you might be in a cloud email service, but if ADFS breaks, your users can't log in, so it becomes a single point of failure. And the other one that I mentioned, the Active Directory sync tool, at the time we did this, that would only run on Windows Server 2003, so we had to deploy that on a different server. They have just brought out a 64-bit version, so
you're going to be able to
get rid of one of the servers in that
soon.
one. So yes, it is quite a lot of estate for that service.
Yeah, I think the minimum number of servers I think is 3, but then you won't have any resilience. So the recommended 4 is that you have it's 5. So a pair of proxies, a pair of ADFS, and the DIR sync. And then depending on what you're doing with a database, you might need a database server as well, or you can use like the SQL Express version on one of the machines.
Okay. Then I have another question. Email is email, as mentioned. Have you done anything else with Office 365? If you haven't yet, are you planning to?
The SharePoint online service, we are in the process of fairly organically replacing an existing legacy intranet with that. My team are using it extensively, but then we're rolling it out organically as teams come up with requirements. We're allowing them to take it on in there, and that seems to be working. Link, we've deployed in my team, and it's fantastically useful actually for relating to Perspicuity, because they're quite a distributed organisation, and they're all on Link. So the ability to federate to external users, federate your Link access to external users has been extremely useful there. Again, it's something we're looking at deploying, but coming back to one of the constraints we had earlier about not being able to deploy software remotely, it requires a desk visit. So it's all about time and resource.
Time and resource. 2 very precious commodities.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Are users accessing Office 365 from OWA on a domain-joined device promoted to re-authenticate? Asks Sam.
I'll have to speak from my personal experience, and then Tim can correct me technically. I believe the answer is yes, they are, but it's a different mechanism. So the OWA authentication, you are taken to the ADFS proxy authentication portal that you've exposed on your own infrastructure, and that's setting a cookie on your device, and that cookie has an expiration time which you set on your ADFS configuration. So provided the cookie hasn't expired, you go straight in to OWA. If the cookie's expired, then you have to re-authenticate, and that does seem to be quite separate, even on a domain-joined device, from the sign-on assistant, which makes sure that your thick client Outlook can authenticate if you are domain joined. Tim can probably give a little more.
Yeah, actually, that's pretty much right what you said. If when you go to use the web access client, if it will check to see if there's a valid cookie there. If not, you end up getting redirected. So in the Schools Network's case, they get redirected to their ADFS, in fact, and then they type their username and password, which checks against their internal Active Directory. And then, providing that's successful, they'll get issued with a new cookie to their desktop, which is then the OWA client will then use to verify that they can access that email.
Okay, lots and lots and lots of questions coming in about Blackberries, because we haven't touched on that. We've talked about iPhones and all of this kind of stuff. How does this work with Blackberries? Does it work with Blackberries? How are people using it? Is it possible?
Yeah, so again, email and calendar and tasks, yes, it does work with BlackBerry. So us as an organisation, we haven't done an awful lot of work with them. For some reason, most of our customers tend to have Windows phones or iPhones. Certainly it does work with BlackBerry. Certainly the email side of things and calendaring and so on does work.
And does are users experiencing email in the same way as stuff coming through just as quickly now that they're, or is there a lag? Or
yeah, so there shouldn't be any more of a lag with the BlackBerry device than any other device. There's also some organisations might have a BIS server in order to receive their email securely on a BlackBerry, and that BIS is now available as a cloud service as well, which I believe Office 365 can use. So probably at a small additional cost, I would imagine. So you can have your emails arrive on your BlackBerry in a secure way, in the same way as perhaps you're currently doing. But as I say, us as an organisation, we haven't done much work around that.
Okay. You guys are on fire today. We've got loads of questions coming in. I'll start with this one from Scott. I wanted to use SharePoint as a general file repository. However, using WebDev to map drive letters to the SharePoint store appears to be very unreliable. Has the panel used this feature, and how have they made it stable?
I think I'm going to defer to Tim on this because I think my answer is it all depends which version of Windows you're using.
Was it Dave? Was it?
It was Scott.
Scott. Yes, Scott. Scott is correct that unfortunately if you want to map a drive to SharePoint, it isn't reliable regardless of whether you've got SharePoint in the cloud or even SharePoint on premise. It's just one of these things that just doesn't seem to be as robust as it should be. But what we find with most of our customers that use SharePoint is that actually it doesn't take long for the users to work out that actually they don't need to know the concept of drives anymore. So when using Office documents and things, SharePoint appears in Office, and you can just browse through SharePoint as if you were browsing through a drive. To find the documents that you want to edit or read. Also, just browsing through SharePoint in your normal internet browser, you browse to the document you want, click on it, and it opens, and it asks you if you want to edit it at that point. So it's just it is a slightly different way for people to work. That perhaps what they used to do was start Word, then say open and browse to a drive. Now they would start Word and they would choose to browse SharePoint. And there's various options within SharePoint that a user can use to add a particular like a favourite location within SharePoint to their Office dialogue, if you like.
Okay, so it's sort of a shortcut.
Yes, and it's just a slightly different way that people will start to work. But generally, we find that people pick it up pretty quickly, actually. So.
Yeah, most people when they. The reaction is, oh, I didn't realise you could do that. And as soon as they realise you can do it, it's actually fairly intuitive in terms of how to start using it that way.
Yeah. So it's just a different window, which is...
Yeah, it's just a slightly different way of working. You're not referring to my H drive anymore. You just sort of go into a particular SharePoint.
I bet people will continue to refer to it as their H drive for some time. Okay, we've got another question from Francis. With regards to the ADFS multiple server needs, could you use virtualization on one server to create the servers needed?
I think there's two questions, really, and I'll answer both of them. Can you use virtualization? Absolutely, and we do. Could you put those on one host? Yes, you could, but you have to think about resilience.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, the reason you have to go to 5 is to avoid a single point of failure. You have to think about resilience.
Yeah.
And obviously you need to your network segment mapping, but I'll assume if you're talking about virtualizing on one server, you've already thought about that.
Okay. Gary has a sort of another ADFS question. Should the in-house system be unavailable, what effect does this have on users in terms of using their email?
They can't log in. It's quite simple.
Okay.
So email will still come into the organisation, so external people emailing you won't see any difference.
Yeah.
But internal users will not be able to authenticate into it by any means, and they won't be able to log in.
If they've got a cookie already, then they will be able to continue to use it when that cookie expires.
Yeah, there may be a window. I mean, this is something we had to deal with recently. We moved hosting centre, and so unavoidably we did have a small email outage while we moved this service.
Okay. How does Office 365 handle multiple primary email domains, i.e. user 1 has user1 at mydomain.com, user 2 has user2 at a different domain.com? Tom says.
Yes, it can.
Yeah.
In the Office 365 administration panel, you can register your domains, and then when you register those domains, you say whether it's for email or for SharePoint or whatever. So all the domains that you've got, you register in there. Obviously, you need to make sure the DNS records and so on are updated accordingly, so that the mail gets routed to Office 365. But yes, you can have multiple domains.
And can you access email outside of the corporate network?
With ADFS, yes, if you've put a proxy.
Okay.
That was the point. That people could
Which is why you need two.
Yeah.
This one, Colin has a question that is interesting to me as well. Can you remotely wipe a mobile device if it gets lost?
I believe you can.
Yeah, it's Windows 7 ones, definitely.
Okay.
And that is integrated with Office 365, so you can register your phones with Office 365 and then you can do things like remotely wipe them. I'm not sure about the other phone platforms, whether...
I'm pretty sure you can. I think it's an active sync feature as opposed to specifically to do with the device per se.
Right.
So if it's an active sync device, then yes.
Then yes. Okay.
Yeah. Certainly if you go into the control portal for an individual user's mail account, you can see phones that are associated with it, and there's a big wipe this phone button.
Yeah. Obviously it's not going to wipe the whole phone, it will just wipe the active sync partition.
But nonetheless something that civil servants who are out drinking should consider, perhaps, before they get on a train. Talking about email outages and so forth, John has a question. How often is email backed up by Office 365? In the unlikely event of a server crash, how quickly can it be expected to be recovered?
I don't know whether...
I love how you handed that off. You're just like, I'm thinking? No, you can...
No, I think that's one for the partners.
Basically, the Office 365 cloud offering, they've published what their service level targets are, and in terms of how often is it backed up, I'm not even sure if they publish that. It's the idea is it's just a service that is going to have 99.9 whatever % uptime, and how Microsoft then provide that service. I don't necessarily whether they publish how often they back it up, but a fairly recent example of quite a catastrophe that happened to the data centre in Ireland. There was an electrical storm. So if you are a UK Office 365 user, your primary data centre will be in Ireland, and that data centre was basically taken out by an electrical storm a few months ago, and it did cause an outage on Office 365. But actually, Microsoft recovered it quite quickly. I think within an hour or two, basically everything was redirected to another European data centre in Holland, I think. And if you compare that with Amazon also using the same data centre in Ireland, they took much longer actually to recover.
I think it's just a different fundamental approach that applies when you're talking about these large-scale cloud environments. They're continuous replication of data, so you've got continuous data redundancy. So, it's not really a case of thinking about how often you back up, because everything is continually replicated. So, in that sense, you've got inherent resilience. I think that there's sometimes in highly regulated organisations, there's a question of, well, where do those replicas sit geographically? Because that can be an issue. But for most organisations, that's just not a consideration, and the cloud provider takes care of that.
Okay, so I've got a couple of other questions as well. In terms of ADFS being unavailable, you can make all users non-federated and they can have access to their email with a different password. Is this something that you guys would look at, or is that going to create a problem that you don't want to deal with?
I would certainly look at it. I mean, I'd be quite interested if the person would send us a link to that.
Sam, send it in.
Because that actually sounds quite a useful resource. I'm guessing there is a process you can do to stop a set of users being federated and make them just cloud accounts, and then you can take them back later. But there are some risks, apparently. If you've changed your AD configuration in the meantime, you can end up losing account information. But
I think it depends, what the reason your ADFS has become unavailable for. If it's something that can be fixed quite quickly, then I don't think you would go to the trouble of reconfiguring your users so that they can get in for half an hour or something.
Yeah.
But if it's quite catastrophic and it could be days before you recover your ADFS for whatever reason, I don't know why it'd be that long, then you might look at an option like that.
Okay. Yeah, so it's just a kind of a time trade-off more than anything else.
So.
Yeah, okay. One more question here from Chris. Office 365 in APAC or in the US are using local data centres?
Not quite sure what the question is, but certainly, I mean, our service we know is coming from Dublin, so it's in the EU. I'm not sure how much information there is about precisely where stuff is hosted, but there is.
I think so. Microsoft do publish. I think they've got 9 or 12 data centres, and they're quite they're quite open about where those data centres are around the world.
And one of the big things that they push is that you can say that it needs to be EU, can't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, if you've got certain governing rules to say that your data has to reside in the EU, then you can.
So have you actually had to deal with any of that? Have you had to deal with them? Has that issue come up yet for you guys? Because obviously you have the UK stuff, but you also have your Emirates.
It hasn't been an issue so far.
Okay.
I mean, it's all in the EU, so.
Question from Gareth here. Is there a particular reason why you chose to use a separate SQL database server for ADFS for the config database rather than just using WID?
Tim, would you like to comment on
that? I'm not 100% sure why you went down that route. I think it may be a resilience reason because the Scores Network already have a SQL infrastructure in place, so they didn't have to put a special one in place for it.
Yeah.
That already has a level of resilience in it.
Yeah.
So the decision was made to use that existing infrastructure because it was there and it's got resilience. It wasn't because of the numbers of users or anything, because obviously the one that the reader's referring to there can handle many thousands of users. I think it was for no other reason other than there was an existing infrastructure.
We're kind of coming towards the end of our time, so I'm going to leave the questions now, and we'll just move back to the final slide. Now that you're up and running, you have some kind of key lessons learned that I'm sure we have probably covered in more detail here, but it was no bad thing to go back over them again. You've been up and running. You say you made your final kind of switch off about a month ago.
Yeah.
Lessons learned? Happy with the situation? Do it again?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do it again. There's a few things which we put on the slide which are still niggles, I think.
Yeah.
Stuff about when you make a change in the global address list, how long it takes to synchronize the offline address list, things like that. Browser security, users can get a little bit unhappy if they have to keep putting passwords in and they don't save. So again, it's about rolling out browser profiles that make sure that you say these sites are trusted sites and things like that.
But that's learning to live with it.
That's learning to live with it, and by and large, it's worked a lot better for us than the previous situation.
Great stuff. Well, we are very close to the end of our time, so if I just say thank you very much, everyone, for coming in. Thank you guys for your plentiful questions. It was really good to have so much input. And then if I can just draw your attention to the further reading slide, I think if you look on the buttons, there is actually a button that you can press to access all that information now. So thank you very much for taking an hour out of your day to join us as we trawl through the murky depths of Office 365 in the real world. Thanks very much.